So this is a talk that Justyna and I have put together and trial this monitoring, so we thought it would be quite cool to present together. At ECan, the land ecology team have been working for the last, say, 3 years on putting together a terrestrial biodiversity monitoring program for Canterbury, and one of the components of that is to look at naturally uncommon ecosystems. And as you probably all know, Braided Rivers are one of Canterbury's quite important naturally uncommon ecosystems, so we put quite a bit of effort into doing something in this one. We wanted to do something that measures or monitors both the extent of the rivers and the condition. To do the extent, we were working with NIWA, who had developed a sort of method of trying to delineate the Braidplain. I'm not sure whether Joe Hoyle's ever presented on that. They use LiDAR and digital elevation models to identify features in the landscape around the rivers, which act as a confining sort of boundary. And they provided us with polygons for each of the braided rivers, which we are using as the extent. Yeah, I won't go too much into that, but so we've got a way of working out where the braided rivers, or the Braidplain is what we've called it, where that should be, and that's our sort of area for monitoring. To measure condition or to monitor condition, pretty much stuck with a sort of traditional vegetation monitoring methodology, using Doc's Recce methodology as sort of a basis for that, looking at succession state and habitats within the Braided River system and ecological integrity of those for a braided river. When we developed the methodology, we wanted to be able to capture the dynamic nature of braided rivers, which means sort of the different succession stages, but it also had to be achievable and affordable. And when you put all that together, there's always compromises. So in developing this methodology, I had quite a lot of help from Justyna, who came in and we sort of discussed how we could do this, and Susan Weiser from Landcare also had quite a bit of input because she's had a long-standing interest in braided rivers. And what we ended up doing is sort of choosing 200-metre lengths, what we call reaches, that span the entire width of the river. And we had a number of those between the sort of source to sea. And within those reaches, we mapped habitats, the waterways, any wetlands, and the different vegetation types that are within the braided river or in the Braidplain. Within each of the vegetation types, the idea was to put some plots to monitor or measure vegetation types, or the species compositions and that kind of stuff within those. When we've trialled 2 rivers so far, and when we did that, we got the field team to kind of determine where the edge of the river was based on sort of while they were sort of looking closely at it. So we didn't use the NIWA's Braidplain because we didn't have it at the time. We now have that, so we would change our methodology a little bit relating to that and use the whole Braidplain. So the vegetation plots, when braided rivers these days, within the Braidplain area, you've got quite a variety of vegetation types. So it's from forested sort of treeland area through shrubland, vineland, grassland, and then you've got your more traditional sort of herb field and bare gravels and moss fields. And so one of the issues we sort of struggled with for a while was what size plots do we use and how do we sort of set them up. And I mean, ideally we would have done nested plots with 20 by 20s in the forest and then sort of nest them for the less, the sort of smaller vegetation types. But that was going to be way too costly. So we've ended up going for different plot sizes. So we have 20 by 20s in the forests, 5 by 5s in the shrubland and grassland, and then in the vineland. And then the others are 2 by 2s, which is not ideal, but again, it had to be affordable and achievable. So we tested it on the Ashburton River in the 21-22 season. Wildlands won the contract to do that and did a pretty brilliant job, actually, of going out and organising access with landowners and stuff like that. came back with a whole pile of plot sheets for us, which is quite labour-intensive job. The data's all been entered in the NIWS data bank at Landcare. The following year we did the rangatata, and there were a few refinements to the methodology based on the feedback from the field teams, which included, we adjusted some of the plot sizes. So I think the shrubland went from actually a 10 by 10 to a 5 by 5 to make it more doable. We added 2 more vegetation types, which was the vineland and the moss field. We, since having done those, I've also had Gretchen Brownstein at Landcare do some analysis, including the power analysis and other stuff on that data. I just essentially gave her the data and said, have a bit of a play with it and see what comes out. So she's done some of that and made some recommendations for future years. No surprises, really, generally. Weedy down the bottom half, really pretty good up the tops. Yeah, it's not really unexpected. Much higher native component above the gorges. Lots and lots of weedy stuff, but with still a bit of native below the gorges. One thing we're thinking about doing, but haven't really made a decision on yet, we sort of trialled last year. We got some high-res imagery flown on the Ashburton. I think it was 5 centimetre resolution. And the idea there would be that we would perhaps do that for every river as we're about to do them and try and extrapolate the information from the ground survey sort of to the whole river. We're still thinking about this and whether the cost of doing that is worth it. But that's just an example, sort of. I think that's the upper Ashburton, and then there's the lower, so it's actually pretty good detail. Although probably not good enough that you could say that there's Rowley or Australis in there. This year, just beginning of July, we found out that we've got funding to monitor 2 rivers per year. We're thinking that we'll do this on a 10-year rotation. So we try and do one big river and an associated sort of 1 or 2 small rivers each year. Right now we're developing a project plan, trying to work out which rivers, exactly what our methodology will be, any adjustments that we might want to make. And hopefully we'll have that done over the next few weeks. And then we'll start going through the procurement process, which anyone else who works at a government organisation will realise is actually quite a long process and, yeah, a bit tedious for those of us who don't really like that sort of admin stuff. And we're hoping to get a team on the ground this season, starting on our next river. And here I hand over to Justyna because she's got a lot more insights into how it actually works on the ground.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so it's been a real pleasure working with ECan on this project. It's been a real big undertaking for our field team. So on the Hakatere, we had 157 plots of data across 10 of those reaches. So they really stretch all the way from the sea up into the headlands, which, it just provides a pretty serious logistical challenge. And on the Rakitata, we had 223 plots and 12 reaches. And here, Helen and I have been talking a bit about the vegetation, but there has also been a bit of a fauna aspect that we've tried out. I would say that there's been a little bit of playing with this methodology over these 2 seasons to try and make sure that we really come up with something that's robust or as good as we possibly can come up with, given sort of logistical constraints. And so the design of this has been a really large component of what we've done so far. So here, this is just, I'm going to be talking about, these sort of things that we've been thinking about in the design of this, which is balancing data quality and quantity, and also having sort of this future-proofing strategy with the design of it. And then also just a little bit of a chat about the challenges and implementation, but I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with these types of challenges. So in terms of design, what makes Braided Rivers really unique, as you all know, is that they're really, really heterogeneous, they're really variable, and they keep on moving, which is really challenging from sort of like a statistical perspective. So Helen was saying that we've been trying to do power analyses, like is this data that we collected actually giving us sufficient information to draw those, if we have big ideas like flying drones and then extrapolating from our plots, do we actually have enough information to do that kind of thing? So first of all, we're talking about really varied habitats, on this macro scale from, the river mouth right through to the headwaters. But also they really, there's a lot of a wide variety of really discrete habitats, right? And we sort of say that they're discrete, but of course, it's not really that obvious. Something that you might call a herb field or a gravel field, somebody else might come through and say, that's actually got a little bit more grass than I would like. And because it creates this kind of mosaic. And these are really large areas. So reach number 8 here, this is on the Rakitara, 60 hectares. And we're just trying to put down some plots and trying to capture what's really happening in that location. I mean, there's never going to be a number of plots in that kind of heterogeneous habitat that's going to give you enough information to fully characterize that ecosystem. So these are some of the challenges with designing this type of thing. Yeah, so good or useful data, are really time consuming to collect. So as Helen sort of mentioned, we've been going with this Recce strategy, which is really awesome because it also works together with large existing data sets that are collected by all sorts of other governmental bodies and all sorts of things. But of course, they take a really long time. So you can either have a large number of plots collecting very basic data, or you can have really intense data that tell you a lot more about what's happening at that location, but not so many plots. So, of course, that's a trade-off. And we're thinking about this in this context of, future-proofing data collections. So this is that reach number 8. So this is kind of just where the POTS comes in. So you can see here that senior vegetation ecologist Roland, he's delineated some of these habitats. And you'll see this is this line where every person would put that line? I think that there's a lot of sort of subjectivity that's involved in that. And so there's this inherent challenge in trying to create a system that everyone can use that will be replicable across years, while also acknowledging that these habitats are so complex. Yeah, so future-proofing these kinds of things, assuming that the person implementing the methodology will change over time. These are all really, really challenging things. In every habitat, but particularly in braided river habitats. Yeah, so there's this issue between standardized techniques versus tailored techniques. So Helen also touched on having variable plot sizes, right? So you can't necessarily compare different sized plots within one analysis. Permanent plots versus temporary plots, of course, it's a little bit challenging because we can't put in permanent plots because they all get washed away, but they are by far the most powerful type. And also considering those future uses, such as whether we incorporate drone imagery or whatever into the future, or maybe mahinga kai considerations might come into play. And have we collected the data for these unknown things that we haven't yet thought that we're going to want to consider in the future? So if we're going to collect data for the long term, we need to be thinking about whether they're adaptable in the long term. Yeah, so implementation, of course, it's challenging from a health and safety perspective in terms of it being really remote work with river crossings and difficult working conditions. So that's not real fun to push through. And there's a lot of operational restrictions that also have a bearing on how we've designed this. So things like we did incorporate mustela tracking across the Rakitara, but actually we require 3 clear weather nights. And that had our teams running backwards and forwards, trying to capture the different reaches, which are all, 4 to 6 hours walk away from one another, trying to clear those tracking tunnels at the correct time in the context of constantly changing weather that is unpredictable and sometimes results in flooding. That might mean that the staff can't get back out, which is a health and safety issue. So all of these things have to be considered in this long-term design, because if they're not, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. And then, of course, expertise. There's a lot of specialist plant species, as Jazz described in his talk. How do you get that specialist botanical knowledge onto the project while also acknowledging that this is a project that will have little bursts of energy during particular seasonal time periods? So I've highlighted here that we've got this timing of the flowering of grasses, which is required to really identify particular species, versus river levels, which change seasonally depending on snowmelt. So there's some really critical windows that we have to be targeting for a lot of these areas to run the surveys, which requires a very active management and flexible approach in management in order to implement this, and that will always be true, which will always make it challenging. Were there any questions?
They are there. What I've done is I may not have done it very clearly. I was just playing with the polygons the other day, and I was trying to pull out the braided, most sort of what's most braided. I was trying to,
The question was whether the 100% exotic dominated forest plots would have originally been native forests, native trees, yeah.
I don't think Braided Rivers would ever have, within that sort of Braidplain active area, would have ever had forest species, none that sort of stayed for very long anyway.